Named by his wife, Hugh Edwards is the famous star at the heart of accusations over sexually explicit photos. She says the newsreader is in hospital suffering from serious mental health issues. Major questions tonight for the Sun newspaper as police rule there was no evidence of a criminal offence in its allegations against Hugh Edwards. We'll ask tonight, would its story ever have been published if it hadn't alluded to questions of criminality? And questions for the BBC too as new allegations emerge of inappropriate messages sent by the presenter on social media to junior employees within the organisation. Also tonight, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is set to make a decision on whether to give some public sector workers pay rises of around 6%. But where's the money coming from? And this. Wham's Andrew Ridgeley tells Newsnight exclusively he wants to create an ABBA-style show for Wham.
I think it could be done, and I think it could be done exceptionally well. The technology exists now, it will only get better.
That interview coming up in 30 minutes. Good evening. The story about Hugh Edwards is a personal one for him and his family. He's being treated as an inpatient in hospital, according to his wife, who released a statement just before 6 o'clock this evening. She said she was naming her own husband primarily out of concern for his mental well-being and to protect our children, she said. It's a story too about the media, about how we report allegations and cover stories. And in particular, many believe it's about how the Sun newspaper has conducted itself in recent days. Tonight, the Met Police said there was no information to indicate that a criminal offence has been committed by the presenter, something you may remember was alluded to in early reporting by the paper. Obviously, it remains a story too about the BBC. And tonight, as the suggestion of any possible criminality in those initial claims fell away, new allegations emerged that Hugh Edwards had sent inappropriate messages on social media to other people who work or worked at the BBC. We'll discuss all of this in detail in a moment. Here's Seema first on the questions raised for the media and the Sun after the events of the last 5 days.
This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
A household name and the trusted voice of the BBC.
Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority.
From royal deaths to big election nights, Hugh Edwards has presented it all.
Well, dear friends, that's BBC News at 10.
This triggered days of continuous coverage, with more allegations being made and people trying to guess who the anonymous presenter actually was.
At 6, Hugh Edwards is the presenter accused of paying a teenager for explicit photos.
In a statement released on his behalf seconds before the 6 o'clock evening news bulletin, his wife said Hugh is suffering from serious mental health issues. As is well documented, he has been treated for severe depression in recent years. The events of the last few days have greatly worsened matters. He has suffered another serious episode and is now receiving inpatient hospital care where he'll stay for the foreseeable future. Once well enough to do so, he intends to respond to the stories that have been published. There's been an outpouring of support for Hugh Edwards on social media from friends and former colleagues, in some cases requesting that he now be left alone and allowed to get better. Journalistically, this episode raises some significant questions. Why the Sun didn't provide hard evidence to support its initial claim, and why the denial of the young person wasn't included in the first report. Is this fair and robust journalism? Another specific question for the paper is about why it initially said the presenter gave a 17-year-old money for sordid pictures, implying alleged criminality, though it didn't explicitly make that allegation. In later stories, the paper's language changed a little, reporting that the young person had been in contact with the presenter from 17, rather than the alleged sexual picture arrangement had started when they were that age. Some media lawyers believe the initial claim could have helped the paper make a public interest case for publishing the story. Tonight, the newspaper says it has no plans to publish further allegations about him and will cooperate with the BBC's internal investigation process. It says we must also re-emphasise that at no point in their original story did The Sun allege criminality. Two police forces who were looking into some of the claims said they had seen no information to indicate a criminal offence had been committed. As the BBC's Director General said today, at the heart of this story are real people with real problems. In the age of instant social media judgments, some will feel he makes a fair point, and one many will reflect on.
Seema Katecha. And as we said earlier, alongside those questions for The Sun tonight, there do remain questions for Hugh Edwards and for the BBC, and new ones which BBC News broadcast this evening, actually around the time of the statement released on behalf of Hugh Edwards. Lucy Manning is special correspondent for BBC News and she is here. First off, just run us through the questions that there are for Hugh Edwards.
Well, first off, I think it's worth saying it's been a very difficult day in the BBC newsroom today, and we've had to report on things that have been hard for people to hear. The police have obviously decided that there is no criminality in the allegations, but there's still a lot for the BBC to grapple with. Most importantly, what they did about the complaint that came in from the family involved, why it took so long for them to contact the family and why it took so long for them to speak to Hugh Edwards about it. There have been other allegations made about Hugh Edwards that will need looking at. The Sun alleged that he'd broken lockdown rules. We reported yesterday on a story about someone who said they'd received abusive messages from them after contact on a dating app.
So that's the last few days. Tonight, Lucy, the BBC has broadcast some new claims about Hugh Edwards.
Yeah, that's right. A BBC employee has told us that they received what they believe are inappropriate messages, that they'd received these messages on social media from the presenter and they believe they were uncomfortable and left them feeling awkward. And they told us, sadly, from my experience, he's been sending suggestive messages to me. They were inappropriate. There is a power dynamic that makes them inappropriate. We have seen those messages which refer to the BBC staff members' appearance, and they do appear to be flirtatious.
And they were sent this year. Just to add to that, Lucy, Newsnight has spoken to two other people, one who currently works at the BBC, one a former BBC employee. I spoke to one of them. This person told me they'd never met the newsreader, and this person said they received late-night messages on social media, including kisses from Hugh Edwards, which they said they believed was an abuse of power. And our colleague Luke Jones spoke to someone who still works here, who told us how the presenter had sent a private message on social media commenting on their physical appearance, which gave them a cold shudder.
I think there's questions for BBC bosses about the culture in the newsroom and the way that complaints can be raised and the way people feel comfortable or not to raise them. Certainly 2 out of the 3 people said that they felt they couldn't report what they think is inappropriate behaviour to BBC managers. One said that, you know, while the BBC bosses have said in the last few days there are procedures put in place for whistleblowing, it's not really clear what to do. And the person I spoke to said that they thought that BBC managers should be looking into the relationship dynamics between when you have very senior members of staff and junior members of staff, some on huge salaries, and great deference is shown to the presenters. You know, this is someone who is very loyal to the BBC, and they believe it's not just a BBC problem, but a problem across the whole industry. The BBC responded tonight saying it's encouraging staff to come forward if they have any concerns, and the Director General did make this point in an email to all staff, and that they're communicating with staff and they would continue to do so.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Let's talk now to various guests who are here. Adam Bolton, a friend of Hugh Edwards, former political editor of Sky News. Also with us, former creative director of the BBC, broadcaster Alan Yentop. Jackie Hames is with us, a board director at the campaign group Hacked Off and a former police officer. And Rod Liddle, who writes for The Sun and Sunday Times, owned by News UK. He's a former editor of the BBC Today programme on Radio 4. We did ask The Sun's senior editors to join us again. they declined. Thank you very much for being with us. Adam Bolton, first of all, what has it been like seeing your friend reported on and spoken about over the last few days?
Well, it's a very sad state of affairs, and obviously one has sympathy for Hugh and for his family and for Vicky, his wife, and I think it's a very brave decision of her to go public at this stage. And
why do you think it's brave? Well,
because clearly it's exposed Hugh to allegations which may or may not turn out to be true, but he's put his name there, and she has done it because she's a journalist herself, and she knows that, presumably, I haven't spoken to her, but she knows that the pressure was becoming unbearable. That said, we're all journalists. Hugh's a journalist, Vicky's a journalist, I'm a journalist. We are in the business of holding the powerful to account for their behaviour, not necessarily for criminality, but for things, the sort of things which we've just been hearing from Lucy about. So I don't think there is any case against the Sun on this for the Sun for misbehaving. I think they've done what journalists have done, and have done indeed what the BBC has done, and the BBC has been since Thursday covering the story in that way. But I mean, even here on Newsnight, you've made a commendable virtue of looking at abusive behaviour in Westminster, for example. So I think for journalists in particular to say somehow the Sun's done something wrong in looking into what is basically serious allegations of resulting in mistreatment of a vulnerable young person, I think that's absolutely fine. And that was how they justified it. They didn't say crime had been committed. They said they were concerned, and the parents of this child were concerned for the way they were being treated by
This is what they actually wrote
Hugh
on Friday. The well-known presenter is accused of giving the teen more than £35,000 since they were 17 in return for sordid images. Sleazy messages are alleged to have started in 2020 when the youngster was 17. On the 9th of July, BBC Sex Probe, top BBC star who, quote, paid child for sex pictures, could be charged by cops. Jackie Hames, do you think the Sun has any questions to answer, or do you agree with what Adam Bolton has just said?
I very rarely disagree with Adam, an distinguished journalist of so many years, but I am profoundly depressed by this unashamed abuse of power by the Sun. I think there are urgent answers needed from the Sun. And as you say, where are Victoria Newton and the editor and Rebecca Brooks? They seem to have forgotten that there were real people involved in this story. They knew that the people involved were vulnerable from a mental health perspective. And there was a suggestion in those headlines of criminality which screamed out at us day after day after day.
Can I ask you, Jackie Hames, why do you say it's an abuse of power on the Sun's part?
Because they're using a very powerful position as the dominator and dictator of the news agenda in this country. And you only have to look at how their article has dominated that news agenda across broadcasting and print news over the last few days. At the same time as huge news stories were happening behind the scenes. We've seen very old newspaper editors being wheeled out to defend newspapers, to say that things have changed since the misbehaviour of the past. I think this shows that nothing has changed.
OK, let's go straight to Rod Little then, who works for News UK. Has nothing changed?
I don't think I've ever heard so much idiocy in my life. The reason that the Sun broke the story is because it was in the public interest. And the fact that every single newspaper and the BBC and ITV have followed it and made it their #1 story is because they also considered it was in the public interest. The reason criminality was involved in the story is because the family of the young person who was at the centre of the very, very first allegation went to the police. And the BBC referred the matter to the police. So the notions about illegality are entirely right and happened. They are down to...
Why then do you think a few days later the Sun then said the story is understood... Sorry, it said in its story on Monday, it's understood contact between the two started when the youngster was 17.
Well, it may have done. I don't know.
No, but what I'm saying is it changed from Friday to Monday.
In what way did it change? Sorry,
well, this is what they said on Friday. The well-known presenter is accused of giving the team more than £35,000 since they were 17 in return for sordid images.
Yeah.
A couple of days later, it's understood contact between the two started when the youngster was 17.
How is that different? I don't understand how that's different. I mean, what the Sun did, and it seems to be entirely right, and I think Adam got this exactly right, and as a friend of Hugh, and I'm a former colleague of the chap, and I wish him all the best, is that illegality was raised. It wasn't raised by the Sun, it was raised by the police, and it was raised by the family, and it was raised by the BBC. I mean, you can't get away from that.
Okay.
What the Sun did, the Sun's point was a more basic point, which was about the BBC after Savile, which was that people who have serious complaints about safeguarding of the BBC are given short shrift. And that would seem to have been, if not proven by the fact that it took 8 weeks, nearly 8 weeks, for this particular issue to find its way to...
Just let me remind you that one of the parents went to the police, and the police told that parent there was no illegality.
Yes, but then the BBC went to the police and handed over the files to the police, and the police had...
Sorry, no, I'm talking about months ago. The dad went to the police months ago and was told there's no illegality.
Yes, and I'm talking about now. The BBC handed their issue over to the police because they felt that there was a possibility of some illegality. The whole point of the Sun story wasn't about illegality. It was about how the BBC deals with complaints from people who feel that they're...
Alan Yenton wants to come in.
It to the police because the police requested them to hand it to it. The BBC did not say it was illegal activity because let's remember, Rod, that the BBC does have a duty of care, not just to and a responsibility, not just...
I accept that, but the issue is we're spending time talking about illegality. The illegality is a side issue. The issue is behaviour that many people would potentially, if it's true, would disapprove of, and the interests of a series of young people who have been in contact, they say, in an unpleasant way with this person.
Yes,
who is,
but I don't think the BBC is in denial about this
at all. Exactly.
But there is still...
We don't know the truth because they're doing their own inquiry now.
But all I'm just saying is that to predicate this on the Sun made a false claim that he had broken the law, it's just not...
Well, I haven't
just
said
not
that.
what happened.
I'm just asking questions. Rod Little, go ahead, and then I'll bring Jackie Holmes back in.
Hello, yes. I think it's telling that the Sun actually failed to print in that very first article the young person's account that nothing criminal happened and downplaying it others. And that shows that the tenure of that article and what they were trying to achieve in what has been a long-standing campaign by Rupert Murdoch on the Sun to undermine the BBC for commercial reasons.
No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't. What the Sun did in its first article was to point out the problems that the couple had in getting any satisfaction out of the BBC. That was the sole point of the first article. Now, many things happened since then, and of course, many things have happened since indeed the name of Hugh Edwards was made public, but also since we began to know a little bit more about it by Monday this week.
Okay, let me bring Alan Yenton. I'm going to bring Alan Yenton back in, if I may. Mr. Yenton, on the programme tonight, on the programme tonight, Lucy and myself have reported claims from others, some who continue to work at the BBC, some who used to work at the BBC, who have said they felt private messages were inappropriate. Yeah. And so the BBC has to continue with its inquiry now
I think
diligently.
Think of a number of things. Number one, this letter was actually a very moving Vicky's letter and a very bold one to do that. She declared the name was her husband's.
I'm asking you about what the BBC does now.
The BBC now, first of all, has a duty of care. She has said he is now in hospital. He has severe mental health problems, and it's not a matter of the BBC dropping this case. The BBC will now begin to investigate this, take the time to do it effectively, and come up with conclusions when they have done so. But there is still there's family to think about. There is on both sides, and turning this into a continuing sort of disproportionate sort of dialogue, you know, on newspaper headlines week after week is not a good idea.
Is it disproportionate, Adam Bolton?
Well, I think there was a public interest in who this person was and what has done. And those people who say the Sun didn't produce the evidence, the Sun obeyed the law and took steps to not expose this person themselves. That's actually what they did. That's why they couldn't publish a lot of evidence, because that would have obviously led people to the details of the case which they couldn't disclose. So they raised an issue about the young person, the concerns of the parents and the conduct of the person in question. And, you know, I do have to say that in spite of all that's being said, neither Hugh nor Vicky have denied the allegations. What they said, they haven't said it's all untrue. What they've said is they'll respond in due course, and Hugh is in a very, very bad way. So, you know, this sort of campaign saying, oh, Rupert Murdoch's trying to, you know, destroy the BBC and destroy Hugh through it and all the rest of it, it just is not borne out by what's happened.
No, but what we need to do is to give it time to allow this investigation to take place.
And the Sun has said tonight it's not going to continue with the story and it's going to cooperate with the BBC and give its evidence to the BBC.
Yeah. And remember,
why do you think it's not going to continue with the story?
Because it doesn't want to create more pressure and more unhappiness for the people involved, having brought it to public attention.
As somebody who writes for The Sun and The Sunday Times, go ahead, and then I'm going to bring Jackie back in, who's shaking her head in disagreement.
The problem is that the Sun has behaved impeccably throughout this. It has done exactly the right thing. It has done the sort of acceptably tabloid journalism, which is holding the powerful to account. It has done so with a degree of measured carefulness. It has tried not to hurt people in the way that it's done it. It didn't name Hugh Edwards. It came down to Hugh Edwards' family to do that, as you say very bravely. And there is absolutely no case to answer from the Sun whatsoever.
Jackie Haynes, you were chuckling a moment or two ago, shaking your head in disagreement. Go ahead. The Sun has reported with measured carefulness.
Measured carefulness.
Whatever thus, Victoria. I mean, it is very difficult, isn't it, to hold someone like the Sun newspaper to account, because they are completely unaccountable. And those screaming headlines would, by any normal person's assumption, be that this unknown presenter was responsible for criminality. And the fact that they admitted...
Let her finish, Rod Little. Let her finish, please. Let her finish. Let her finish, please, Mr. Little. Go ahead, Jackie Haynes.
And the fact that they omitted in that very first article that the young person involved had denied any criminality, I think is very telling in the slanted way that it was produced. And unfortunately, it is picked up. And that's what the average person in the street will see day after day, is an allegation of criminality. And you only have to look at the social media fallout to see that that's the message that was picked up.
Quick answer from you, Rod Little. Why didn't the journalist include in the story on Friday the WhatsApp from the young person at the centre of their claims? The denial of the story, saying it was rubbish.
Because my guess is when the first story was written, he hadn't seen it. They spoke to their parents.
Well, it came in on Friday.
Well, it came in at 20...
Hang on, let me finish. They were dealing exclusively at that point with the parents, and they were very, very worried about the health of the young person who was involved in this. And I think all of this shows the sheer bankruptcy and bias of the hacked off.
Talking about the Sun. This is not all just about the Sun.
Do not want to see themselves, revealed to the public.
OK, we're going to have to pause there. Thank you all very much. Thank you for talking to our audience. Tomorrow, the government's expected to say what pay rise it's prepared to give teachers, junior doctors, prison officers, the police, armed forces and civil servants. It's understood the independent pay review bodies have recommended a rise of 6 or 6.5%. Now, such an increase could bring the wave of strikes to an end. But the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is reported to have told ministers there's no more money beyond the 3.5% that's already been budgeted for by different departments. So delivering the full pay rise implies more cuts to public services they deliver. We'll get the politics from our new Insight editor, Joe Pike, in a moment. First, with the economics, here's Ben.
What would the economic impact of granting a 6% plus pay rise for public sector workers for 2023-24 be? That's what we understand the independent public sector pay review bodies have recommended to ministers. And what would the impact of not granting that award be? Those are the questions the government is grappling with right now. Would it be inflationary? That's what the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have both recently suggested. But here's some important context. The yellow line shows private sector pay currently rising at around 7.1% year on year. The blue line shows public sector pay currently running below the private sector at 5.9%. And as you can see, it's been below it for the past 2 years. Economists look at this evidence and mostly conclude the argument that a 6% pay rise for the public sector would lead to a dangerous wage price spiral in the UK is not particularly credible. However, public finance experts do estimate that a 6% public sector pay rise across the public sector would cost roughly an additional £5 billion relative to the existing government spending plans. And if that were funded by government borrowing, it would inject more spending power into the economy, and it would, at least to some degree, add to inflationary pressure. Would that extra borrowing have a negative impact on the public finances? It would certainly jeopardise the chances of meeting the government's chosen fiscal rules. This shows the amount of headroom Jeremy Hunt gave himself against meeting his chosen target of having debt falling as a share of GDP in 5 years' time in the March budget, £6.5 billion. As you can see, this was the lowest comparable headroom of any Chancellor against their own fiscal rules since 2010. The reality is that £5 billion of extra borrowing for public sector pay probably would wipe out that headroom. In light of this, we understand the Treasury has told departments that if they want to pay public sector staff an extra 6%, they'll have to find the extra money from within their own existing budgets, with reports of departments and their cabinet ministers like Steve Barclay and Gillian Keegan being asked to identify additional savings of £2 billion. But of course, public services are under considerable strain already. What would the impact be of further cuts to services such as education, prisons, the courts and the police?
It will mean that already faltering performance gets worse. There quite simply isn't any meaningful fat to trim in these public service budgets at the moment. There's nothing that you could quickly salami slice without that having a noticeable impact on public service performance.
Also, unions such as the teachers say they are on strike not only for higher pay, but because they say schools are badly under-resourced. It's far from clear that they would stop their industrial action if their pay rises meant cuts elsewhere in education services. Many economists are urging the government to get out of this bind by raising taxes to pay for the public sector pay rise. This would offset any inflationary impact, protect the fiscal rules and avoid the need for cuts to public services. And it might help end the strikes. Yet it should be noted that taxes are already rising sharply, and with a general election looming, this is for obvious reasons not an attractive avenue for ministers. But with the independent pay review reports on ministers' desks and a decision expected very soon, it seems to be a choice they cannot duck.
Let's talk to Joe Pike, our Insight editor. So has the Prime Minister decided what to do?
Not formally at Victoria, but tomorrow he'll meet with the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt. They're going to make a decision, and I'm told they will announce it soon after. And I'm told by a senior government source who's been involved in this process that everything is moving towards a point where Rishi Sunak decides to accept the recommendations of those pay review bodies. So for the relevant workers, it would mean around a 6% pay rise. I'm told that funding gap will be filled not through further borrowing, but through finding, as Ben touched on there, further efficiencies in government budgets. Now, this solves two problems, potentially brings in a third problem. Of course, not borrowing more money is potentially good for the public finances. That's not going to happen. Great. The PM's avoided some criticism from some in his party. He could have rejected the recommendations of these pay review bodies. One minister telling me tonight he should do that because, quotes, we have no money. But of course, the PM in recent months has used the independence of these organisations to slightly distance himself from these complex decisions, to slightly depoliticise this whole issue. It seems like he wants to still keep that situation as it is. Finally, the problem that this does potentially create, if this is the decision the PM makes tomorrow morning, where does he find the money in departmental budgets? Now, one government source has told me this is just about, quotes, reprioritising spending. But of course, health and education unions are already arguing there is no fat left to cut in departmental budgets. And also, they of course have been arguing for months it's about far more than just pay. It's relevant because one education union in England, the NSUWT, has said their members have voted for further strike action, and also because, Victoria, of course, tomorrow, junior doctors in England who are members of the BMA are starting this 5 days of industrial action. That is unprecedented, and of course it could make Rishi Sunak achieving his big pledge of reducing waiting lists far more difficult.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you. Andrew Ridgeley was in one of the biggest bands of the 1980s. As you know, it was called Wham. And now a new documentary on Netflix celebrates the friendship of him and George Michael, who Andrew affectionately nicknamed Yog, and the success of the two best friends who formed the group together as teenagers. I've been talking to Andrew Ridgeley about the documentary, which features interviews from the time as well as old footage. He talks about how the band coped with fame back then, about the undesirable consequences of it, the dilemmas George Michael faced about his own sexuality. And we also talked about whether Andrew Ridgeley could envisage creating an ABBA-style Avatar show for Wham. First, we began with the old days. Early on in the documentary, George asks, how could these two idiots become so bloody massive? How?
Yes, a good question. Well, the music was superb. We took the recording, the songwriting and the recording seriously, but not us. Neither of us formed a band initially as schoolboys to be celebrities or to have fame thrust upon us. We did it to write songs and perform.
George says this of you in the documentary. Andrew was this kind of idol that I had. He was the first person I'd ever hung around with that was much stronger than me. Almost everything came from Andrew. Andrew changed my life in exactly the way someone needed to change my life if I was going to be a pop star. No one knew then in the 80s, when Wham were at the height of their fame, really what your contribution was, how important you were to this band. You co-wrote Wham Rap, Club Tropicana, Careless Whisper. What was it like to have your role then minimised by the critics and by outsiders?
It irritated a wee bit at first, but my relationship with Yog was, very much one of equals. It could never have been worked otherwise. And Wham was always more than the sum of its parts. I think that's what I think gave it its sort of unique quality and character. So I learned to live with it.
Did you?
Yeah. One can't let those things weigh one down. They'd be an encumbrance that would inhibit so much of life.
It's my first Top of the Pops, and it's their first Top of the Pops. Wham!
Famously, you were invited on Top of the Pops, which I should say to our younger viewers, absolutely every teenager watched back then. How important was that TV appearance in taking Wham to stratospheric heights?
It was really the moment, because it's a national audience and it revealed us to our public. And had we not had that, unlikely that we'd have had to release another track, to be honest.
Let me take you to the place where membership's a smiling face.
We see in the doc that after shooting the video for Club Tropicana in Ibiza, one morning George told you that he might be gay or bisexual. How would you describe that period? How did you react?
Well, we were riding high. The Club Trop was our first location video, and it was the first kind of inkling of our elevation status. And we were sort of shooting a video, but also on holiday. He gave me a ring and asked me to go and see him, or just to come and have a chat. It made no difference to us. I couldn't see that it would make any difference. Actually, at the time, I didn't see that it made much difference to Wham. the difference we thought it would make would be to his dad, and that's why we counselled against him making it public. But as he says in the documentary, you know, that came at a bit of a cost, that decision not to.
He said, for many years my support system was Andrew. Did that ever feel like a responsibility, a big responsibility?
No, it didn't, and I was unaware of that. You know, our friendship was such that the support was there by dint of that fact. Certainly, that's how I felt. We had been in each other's company and pockets for a decade, and more. And I think he was referring to when he then embarked upon his George Michael career proper, because it's when you're on your own, it's a very different kettle of fish.
You met each other at school. What did you think of him when you saw him first, George? Keeping it as clean as you can.
Well, it's difficult, really. And what did I first think of him? I thought he was pretty loud, you know, brash, young thing.
You admired him, in other words?
Oh, yeah. I thought, now there's a boy I want to sit next to.
George speaks of the end of the band. If I was looking for happiness, I should not be trying to catch up with Michael Jackson or Madonna. Does that suggest that the nature of his personality, you could call it his ego? That's a word used pejoratively. I don't mean it like that. But
no,
do you think that's George's...
He did have an ego.
OK, fair enough.
Yeah.
But was that a cause of his unhappiness at points?
It drove him.
Right.
And his ambition, it had consequences.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it drove him to compete and drove him to position himself alongside those that he perceived as his peers and as at the very elite level. And, you know, that ambition and aspiration did have a personal cost. It would have a personal cost for anyone.
How would you describe the personal cost to him then?
Well, he was a very private man, and he enjoyed the company of his friends. He wasn't particularly gregarious beyond that situation, and he didn't like the intrusion. He didn't really. It was very much a sort of Faustian pact that he had with success, because he really didn't like the aspects of the fame, the negative aspects of fame that came with success.
I know you went to see ABBA Voyage in East London, where we see 2D versions of ABBA from 1979. They are avatars. What did you think of it?
I absolutely loved it. I was transported.
Can you ever envisage trying to recreate something like that for Wham?
Yes.
Can you?
Yeah, I think it would be fantastic to have Wham at its pomp playing live.
So would I, but obviously George Michael is no longer here. Are there ethical questions?
Of course there are ethical questions, and that decision would be a mutual decision between myself and the estate, should it ever come to it. And I can't speak for them. I don't know how they would feel about it, but I think it could be done. I think it could be done exceptionally well. I'd pay to go and see it.
How much do you miss him?
Well, a lot. Not all the time, but you know, it's like when you lose someone. The intensity of that loss reduces over time, and the frequency. But there are obviously moments where our relationship is thrust front and foremost. The documentary is one. So, you know, I've been closer to Yog over this last 2 or 3 years than I had for a little while.
And obviously you love him still dearly.
Yeah. I think anyone who knew him loved him and had a great affection for him. You know, he was an exceptionally kind and generous friend, and he was bloody funny as well.
Andrew Ridgely, thank you very much for talking to us.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Victoria.
And the documentary is called Wham! Right, we've got some of the front pages of the newspapers tomorrow, and many of them have the same story. The Times: wife reveals Hugh Edwards is BBC star in eye of storm. And then a story about European temperatures edging towards 50 degrees C. Front page of the Mirror: BBC star Hugh's in hospital after scandal. Wife names news anchor as cops say no crime committed. The Guardian: Hugh Edwards named as the BBC presenter at centre of allegations. And then Britain and the US asking Kyiv for a, quote, bit of gratitude. And the Star: it's Hugh. And finally, Hugh Edwards in hospital for mental health care, says his wife. And finally, the Metro: shock statement in BBC crisis. It is Hugh Edwards. That's all from us tonight. Kirsty is here tomorrow. Good night.